When framing a shot for rendering, it's super important to know where the borders of the frame are, what's going to be in the rendering and what's not. And when you render by default, you don't necessarily see the same thing that you see in your viewport. I'll select that physical camera viewport and we'll do a test rendering. Up here on the main toolbar, we're looking for these little teapot icons. And we're just going to do a standard test render using the so-called scanline renderer. And that's the teapot with a little lightning bolt on it, render production. Click on that and we get a window popping up and it's just going to render the current view. And it may take a moment because I've got a pretty heavy scene here, but there we go. We've got our rendering. Now notice that we don't see the exact same thing in this view, especially if you look at the bottom here. We're getting more cropping on that sofa down here. We're seeing less of the sofa than we do in the rendering. And that's because we're not seeing the safe frames. We don't know where the borders of the frame are. Let's enable those. In the viewport, we can go to the name of the camera here in the menu. And we're looking for an item here that says Show Safe Frames. Turn that on. And now we have a yellow border around the renderable area of that particular frame. Now we really know what we see is what we're going to get. And this framing now exactly corresponds to the rendering that we just made. And we can verify that. We can go back to the rendering we just did. We don't have to render it again. Just open up the rendered frame window. That's the teapot that has kind of a square border around it. And now the framing is exactly the same. The sofa is getting cut off at the same location in both of these images. Very cool. Now, while we're here, I also want to mention something that's pretty useful with the physical camera, especially for architectural renderings. You may want to shift the horizon line up or down. In this case, I'm seeing a lot of the ceiling, and I don't really need to see that. To frame my shot pretty well, then I can actually shift the camera's view plane. And that's going to emulate the behavior of a so-called view camera, also known as a tilt-shift camera. Select that physical camera, go into the Modify panel, and then if we look around down here, scroll down, we're going to find a section here that says Perspective Control. Open that up. And then we have lens shift, horizontal and vertical. And vertical is the one we care about, so we can click and drag on that. And if the camera is level, if it's not rotated relative to its own x-axis, then when we shift this up and down, we're going to get a very architectural look in which all the vertical lines are straight up and down, but we have the ability to sort of pre-crop the image. We don't have to render out a big frame and then select part of it. That's a bad idea, especially since some of these renders can take a very long time. This little vertical shift is super useful. All right, cool. So that's how we can shift the camera view plane and how we can turn on Show Safe Frames. And finally, if you want to use the keyboard shortcut for safe frames, it's simply Shift F to enable or disable the safe frames.